Because we have only 1 hour this room, and we have 3 students, and they all want their time and should have their time. So as you all know, the idea is to bring philosophy and history a little closer to actual science, not by teaching philosophers or historians, but by making students think about their own work with the help of historical developments and with the help of philosophical concepts. And so we have 3 great students, I think. And the first one is Yuval Shoam from the Department of Cell Biology and what was the other one?
Physiology.
Yeah. Okay. And his supervisor is supposed to come, but she is not yet here. But Yuval will start about his work on memory research.
Thank you very much. So that's going to be just like brief and like not too deep dive into this topic, which is very big. And I'm going to present myself very shortly. I'm a PhD candidate at Knapper's lab, where we study memory and memory-related mechanisms. And in this work, under the supervision of Ute and the help of Sophie, I study memory research through the prism of scientific realism about unobservables. So, just for a brief introduction, what is scientific realism about unobservables? The basic problem is that science is repeatedly facing or tackles entities which are unobservable, meaning that we can't really see by human senses and maybe even can measure by any available measuring device. And the question that arises from this is how should the science treat them, and how and if can we even make any valid assumptions on things that we can't measure. Some very famous objects like those are the atom, which is now observable, but maybe dark matter or dark energy that you know that we can't really see, but we assume that they are maybe real. So on the two sides of this debate, we have, or we more historically had until the early 1900s, the debate of, on the one side, instrumentalism or positivism, which claimed that science should only study entities that we can observe and measure physically by any of the human senses, and all the other entities which are not observable are good in theory, but we shouldn't assume that they are correct, and we should use them only as instruments. For example, for dark matter, if you are familiar with, we can't know why the galaxies are moving a little different from the mechanics that you know, so we explain it by dark matter, but they say we shouldn't assume that this dark matter really exists as it is, and we shouldn't study it, and we shouldn't even think that we would be able to actually know what it is. On the other side, we have the realists, the scientific realism, that they claim that we can and we should study those unobservable entities as with some manipulation and with some building evidence, they can be counted as scientifically real as long as they can help us explain real and observed phenomena. So a really famous case of this was the atom, a really famous case from the physics and chemical sciences. Just to give you a brief dive for us to better understand, there were some voices. One of the famous positivists was Ernst Mach, the famous Austrian physicist, that he was pretty skeptical about those imaginary particles that we invented called atoms, and he said that science should be only economy of thought, meaning that science should help us explain the reality in the most simplest way, and not diving into some, once again, imaginary particles that we won't be able to ever understand perfectly with the human perception. On the other hand, just for this debate was, for example, Ludwig Boltzmann, also Austrian physicist from the same era, that claimed that he was a big believer of atoms, and he said that as long as they can help us understand the observable reality, they should be studied and should be considered as possible real entities. The interesting part is that the scientific realism of atom wasn't built in a day, right? It's always a process until it's being observed, if at all. But if you are familiar with the atom, so Einstein was explaining a Brownian movement with the model of the atom, and also Jean Perrin, the famous French scientist, was actually found indirect evidence that helped him to reach the same Avogadro number, which is the number of molecules in a mole. So the realism of this entity, of this atom, it was changed with time. Well, there were different models, but the fact that it might be real was building with time until eventually it was also observed with microscope that we didn't have in the time. And there are many more examples. For example, all the concepts of genes and heritage, the fact that cells or parents cells are actually transferring physical substance that carry characters was imaginary crazy idea, and that was studied in a realistic way until it was eventually in the end of the process were decoded by Watson and Crick. But realists were not always right? Because some of the crazy idea found to be totally wrong. For example, the phlogiston, if you're familiar with, from chemical science, it was believed to be, well, until the mid-1700s, it was really popular in chemical science. It helped to explain many theories. It was believed to be material which is in any flammable material, and whenever it is heated up, the phlogiston goes up in the form of fire. And that was found to be totally wrong, and something which is much more like new to our era, more or less, was the ether theory about this material around us in which the light is being moving, and was believed even until the mid-1900s in the USSR. But it was also found to be totally wrong. So today we have less the debate between the pure positivists. We have much less pure positivists, but also we are debating on many of such entities, for example, dark matter, dark energy, multiverse, everything that is related to quantum mechanics, and obviously even the basis of consciousness, which is much more related to my work. I think I'll skip it because of time, but the idea is that philosophically, it is building the realism of such entities, is building with time, with building evidence, with a process. It's not in one day. And if you can manipulate something, and if you can use it to manipulate something else, the fact that it's more real is being strengthened. So, for my process, I study memory, which is, when I was sitting with Ute, she was asking the very legitimate question of, wait, memory is very much observable, right? So this is a good question, and indeed, memory is pretty much an anomaly, because on the one hand, subjectively, from first person, memory is highly, highly observable, right? You know that you memorize, you can retrieve memory, you can use it. This is what we do all of the time. But if you think about memory as a process, once again, you have the event doesn't exist anymore, and here you have a process that is maybe unobservable, that lives and trace in our mind, or currently within our brain, and this trace is still partially, and was even more in the history, was highly unobservable. Like something in our mind and brain changed that we don't know, and now we have the memory. So the interesting part of my work will ask about these type of processes, which are how could scientists really study this memory trace, which is the effect we have, but not only memory trace, but some other processes, for example, the strengthening and the weakening of memory over time, which are totally invisible. We can only see the result of we have or we don't have memory, but the processes were totally unobservable. So the question is, through what experimental and conceptual practices scientists proceeded to actually tackle those unobservable entities that are related to memory. So the first thing that we needed to do, and there is plenty of literature on this topic, is to actually map the history of memory research, which is pretty long, but changed in specific revolutions that really changed the practices of memory research. And so I was reading into literature, and also I'm teaching in a history of memory course, so it was also I was very connected to. So I'm not going to dive into this, don't worry, but in the very origins of ancient Greek, history was also studied, but only from subjective experience and thought. And it was first changed to be more scientifically in the first revolution, led by Ebbinghaus, about the experimental psychology in the late 1800s, where memory was started to be learned and studied empirically. But the thing that is important to understand, that the study of memory went through different revolutions that changed the way that we can observe and we can't observe other things. Obviously, the biggest one is with the advancement of technologies. for example, fMRI and all the brain imaging and optogenetics, which let us actually manipulate some certain cells. So the idea of what is observable and non-observable also changing with time and with the technology, like many other fields, like the atom that I showed. So with the short time we have, I'm just going to give you two really nice examples from the very beginning of the scientific study of memory. So the first one, from the very pioneering scientist that actually started to study memory, was Hermann Ebbinghaus, the German scientist. And he actually, he wanted to tackle the memory trace, this unobservable trace that he actually called invisible threads. He was also referring it as unobservable. And he was assuming, he had a hypothesis that we have some trace even after we learn and even after we forget. And he was thinking how he can study this, well, really unobservable entity. So what he did is he made a really creative experimental setup, and he taught his subjects to learn like non-natural syllables, like totally invented, non-existing in the literature, until they remember it in 100%. And then he was looking at two things. The first one is how fast what is the forgetting curve, how fast they forget it. But more interesting, I won't dive into this, but more interesting into our topic is the fact that he showed that even after someone is totally forgetting the list and he can't repeat the list anymore, his real learning time was faster. Yeah, was faster, and he called it savings. And this is actually a first way to look into this trace that it was unobservable because the subjects couldn't repeat the list, but he showed that by relearning those non-familiar from before syllables, they could be 30 to 40% faster. So he actually reached an unobservable trace, unobservable entity from a creative way. Another really good example is from George Sperling, the American scientist, that he was looking at something else. So if Ebbinghaus was looking about forgetting after learning, Sperling was looking on forgetting before learning. He was also kind of using induction from like self and other people experiences to state that more is seen that can be remembered. So he was hypothesizing that you have a memory that is very quickly disappear. Like you see everything, you collect it in your brain, but it disappears. So you can ask, how can you even study such an unobservable entity which you can't even consciously access, right? Because this is only a hypothesis. So he was also very creative, and he taught his subjects this, like he showed them this matrix of letters of 3 on 4, and he showed it for half a second, and then he asked them to remember as much as letters they could, and the average was 4.5 letters. But he was assuming that everything was collected in the brain. The only thing that is that some of it is fading before they can even retrieve it. So what he did was, once again, a creative experimental setup. He showed them the full matrix, then he disappeared, and then he gave them a sound. The sound was cueing them to only retrieve one of the rows, like the top, the medium, or the bottom one. And he showed that when you are cued with sound, even after the image disappeared, you can retrieve 100% of the letters. So for example, he showed the matrix, it then disappeared, he gave them a sound, and the subject was fully reporting the full letters. And this is actually an interesting and once again creative way to access a totally unobservable type of memory that he was the first to discover, and he called iconic memory, which is once again was unobservable until it was maybe proved to be real. I'm finishing in 2 minutes. Those are just two examples. As I showed you before, memory is really progressing, and in each phase we have different type of unobservable entities, and now I'm looking at some on different things about, for example, the process of memory being consolidated, being strengthened and weakened with time, which is still in some point unobservable. Also the engrams, and I think the most interesting for me is even the correlations between the neuronal activity that we see to the actual conscious activity, conscious experience, which is 100% unobservable today, right? We have the neuronal activity, we have the conscious experience, but we don't know what is the connecting line, if at all. So many scientists also try to tackle this. And just a word about my research. I think I won't tell too much about it because of time, but I think it's really connected for me, looking at previous studies and also looking at my study to think about how can I be creative in my research as well, and how can I look and maybe change the experimental setup to understand what I can see, what I can observe, and what I cannot, and how can I make conclusions about things that I cannot actually observe at first place. And that's it. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you. You were just on time because we started 5 minutes
Perfect.
later. And so we wait for the Yuval Shoam effect in memory research.
Thank you.
Okay, we can have some